Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk for a Friday Mailbag special. Now, this is a show where we talk general aviation for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, and each week I hear from many of you, but often there's not enough time to include all of your emails in the weekly show. But I have a particularly good collection that I wanted to share with you today. Several of them are in response to episode 267, in which we talked about what led to the fatal breakup of a medevac Pilatus PC-12 in Nevada. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/267. First up is a recorded listener question, and I prefer having recorded questions, so I give them top priority on the show. In a moment, I'll tell you how to send me a recording asking that question that's been on your mind. Here's Daniel.
Hey, Max, this is Daniel. I was listening to your episode about the impossible turn, and something occurred to me which I haven't heard discussed anywhere else. And that is the difference between renters and owners. As a renter, I don't have the slightest hesitation about putting a plane into a field. My priority is completely about my survival and my passenger's survival. Whereas as an owner, I can understand having a bigger emotional attachment to the aircraft. And I might be more likely to want to turn around and try to get back to a runway. In fact, if I was the builder, I would be even more invested. If I had spent 10 years building an airplane, I would definitely be trying to get back to the runway. So I'm just curious if you read anything about that and how the psychology differs between renters and owners.
Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to record your question. What you say makes total sense. And no, I've never read anything about this before, but I totally agree with your analysis. And it certainly fits an impossible turn accident that occurred perhaps 10 years ago in an airport very close to where you and I both live, and that's the Livermore, California airport. As you well know, when you take off from that airport on either 25 left or 25 right, you have the dream scenario for an engine failure with a golf course and a number of grass fields below you as you take off. And if I ever have an engine failure at a nearby airport, I pray that it's taking off from one of these runways at Livermore. And yet there was an experimental aircraft that took off from one of these runways, and witnesses reported that his engine failed at approximately 200 to 300 feet AGL. But rather than land in any of these numerous fields, he made the impossible turn back to the airport, and he crashed just a few feet before the runway threshold. That aircraft then burned up completely to the ground, and for a number of weeks afterwards, you could see the residual markings anytime you flew over the airport. Sadly, the two people on board died. I'm guessing the pilot was the owner of the aircraft, since you can't rent an experimental aircraft. And there's a good chance that he also spent years building that aircraft. And what we all need to remember is that when an engine quits, the airplane now belongs to the insurance company, and you owe it nothing. Do not try to save the aircraft. Instead, do everything you can to try to save yourself. Daniel, thank you so much for your question. And if you'd like to record a question as Daniel did, there are two easy ways to do that. First, you can go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Listener Questions at the top of the page, which will take you to our SpeakPipe app where you can record up to 90 seconds. Or just use the Voice Memos app on your phone, record a question, and email it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. And here's an email from new Patreon mega supporter Bill Haug. He says, my son Billy Haug, who recently passed his private in September 2022 and his instrument in February 2023, clued me into your fine podcast. We are so proud of his aviation accomplishments and his service to our country as a member of the Air National Guard. Special thanks to his CFIs at High Sierra Pilots in Carson City and Minden, Nevada, Connell Ford and Matt Stubblefield, and his DPE, Mark Montague. Billy is working furiously on his commercial certificate and is enrolled in the American Airlines Cadet Program. As for myself, after 44 years of flying, enough GA to get my private while in college, then Navy flight training, and several years as a Navy pilot, and over 30 years as an airline pilot, I'm re-entering the GA world. It is indeed a whole new world of flying, and I find your podcast most helpful. I especially admire your willingness, in the interest of promoting aviation safety, to share your own errors and close calls in their fullness. Most pilots are unwilling to volunteer in this way, except in a de-identified report, such as an ASAP or ASRS report. Kudos to you for this, for leading the way and setting the example. It reminds me of the best practices in aviation safety, many of which I learned at the Navy's Aviation Safety Officer School at MPGS Monterey in 1980. I'm looking to contribute if I can as a CFI and recently passed my FIA written, onto the FOI written, and the practical test. Regarding episode 267, what led to the fatal breakup of a medevac Pilatus PC-12 in Nevada, I appreciate your astute analysis of the ADS-B data. There is one potential scenario you left out as to the cause of possible autopilot disconnect. I preface my comments by saying that, like you, I have never been a Pilatus pilot and am unfamiliar with that aircraft's systems. I base my comments on experiences with many different turboprop and turbojet aircraft. I believe the temperature at takeoff of the medevac flight was around freezing with light snow and overcast ceilings. The first few thousand feet of climb would have been in the prime temperature range for aircraft structural icing, and the prompt implementation of anti-icing and de-icing procedures would have been critical. If an inversion existed above, as it often does here in the Reno area, prime icing temperatures would have existed for many thousands of feet. It is possible that the differential wing icing and or flight data sensor icing could lead to disconnect of the autopilot. If there were a large enough differential in lift between the wings or pitot-static or flight data sensors had become iced, this could lead to an autopilot disconnect. Now the pilot would be wrestling, as you said, in night instrument conditions with a potentially out-of-trim, iced airplane, perhaps with different lift issues and or compromised flight data systems. This is a very difficult situation requiring immediate application of very disciplined instrument flying skills while also considering and possibly troubleshooting system failures. Both of these actions fall under the aviate column of aviate, navigate, communicate, and it appears the pilot never made it to the navigate and communicate steps, so he was possibly saturated with the demands of aviate. This was a terrible tragedy for the local Reno community, especially the small tight-knit communities of first responders, paramedics, in-flight medics, and the CrossFit community. CareFlight paramedic Ryan Watson leaves behind a young wife and a 1-month-old baby. A GoFundMe website has been created for Ryan's family. Ryan was a CrossFit buddy of my son who instructs at Upstate Nevada CrossFit here in Reno. Ryan's wife is also a CrossFitter, and the community is grieving and providing support for the family. The in-flight nurse, Ed Percola, RN, was also known in the CrossFit community and is a Marine Corps military veteran. He leaves behind a wife and young kids, and he also has a GoFundMe website. The loss of a pilot, flight medic, in-flight nurse, a patient, and a family member, and the terrible loss to the family members left behind are stark reminders of the stakes involved when we take to the skies. I have lost Navy shipmates to aviation mishaps, as well as colleagues in the airline business. Even a flight student from my Navy days instructing in Lockheed P-3 Orions. All of us in the aviation community will suffer losses, and we will grieve. We must, however, pause and resolve to honor those we lose by rededicating ourselves to the highest levels of professionalism, safety, and training, and pledging to prevent such occurrences on our watch. Thank you again for your dedication to aviation safety. Sincerely, Bill Haug, Reno, Nevada. Bill also sent me a separate note that there's now a GoFundMe for Scott Walton, who was the pilot of the medevac flight. He said he leaves behind a wife and kids. I'll go ahead and include a link to the 3 GoFundMes that Bill mentioned. Thanks, Bill, so much for your comments. And I had a text message from my good friend John Fiskus of the Flight Academy, which is a Cirrus-focused flight school up in the Seattle, Washington area. He said, good podcast on the PC-12. I have about 700 hours in them and have had the autopilot kick off in moderate turbulence a few times. Both the NG models and the 47 series do it. I don't like it too much. No, I wouldn't like that either, John. I appreciate a good autopilot. And here's an article that's somewhat related. It comes from John Zimmerman. This was posted in airfaxjournal.com. John is a VP at Sporties. He says, what's wrong with Pilatus PC-12 pilots? Now, just note here, John is not saying that there's anything wrong with a plane, just some of the pilots. And here's what he wrote. Quote, as we typically find in this article series, the cause of such accidents usually has more to do with the pilot than the airplane, hence the last word in the title. That means it's worth our time to examine the safety record of a specific airplane type, even if you don't fly that model. There are lessons for all pilots. And further on, he continues, searching the NTSB database shows very few such accidents, only 5 in the last 10 years. There have only been 22 fatal accidents worldwide, including military, since the PC-12's first delivery, during which time the airplane has racked up roughly 9 million hours flown. Doing the quick math leads to a lifetime fatal accident rate per 100,000 hours of 0.24, and probably lower for U.S.-only operators. That compares quite favorably to the TBM's lifetime rate of around 1.1, or the overall GA fatal accident rate, which was 1.02 in 2019, for non-commercial fixed-wing aircraft. Let's quickly examine all 5 fatal accidents from the last decade. Note 2 of the 5 accidents mention the autopilot. From Lake Wales, Florida, a new PC-12 pilot was climbing through 25,000 feet in IMC when he began a right turn to avoid potential weather. During the turn, the autopilot disconnected for undetermined reasons, possibly due to turbulence, possibly because the airplane got too slow, or possibly due to simple failure. Instead of flying the airplane, the pilot attempted to retest the autopilot, presumably to clear a fault, and lost control in the process. Bank angle increased past 70 degrees, and airspeed increased to 175 knots beyond the red line. The pilot eventually tried to recover, but pulled the wings off during the dive, and the airplane broke up in flight. Burlington, North Carolina, a professional pilot flying lab samples, was climbing through 3,000 feet at night and in clouds when ATC asked him to reset his transponder code. Shortly thereafter, the pilot lost control and crashed. And by the way, we had a similar accident like that probably 20 years ago in the Santa Rosa area, where Cessna 182 took off, and as he was climbing through, I think, 7,000 or 8,000 feet, ATC asked him to turn his transponder on, and he immediately lost control and crashed. Continuing, the NTSB report mentions possible confusion about the status of the autopilot. There is a scenario where it might appear to be engaged, but in fact is not. But it's impossible to know for sure. The end result was a classic spatial disorientation accident. And there's the final thread to pull on, the autopilot. Single-pilot operations on a high-performance airplane, especially in bad weather, mean the autopilot is a critical component, essentially an unnamed second crew member. Fortunately, the Honeywell autopilot found on the Pilatus is a very capable and dependable model, but as the examples above prove, it's not foolproof. At least 2 and maybe as many as 4 of these accidents featured some type of autopilot anomaly. These can be caused by normal limitations. Turbulence can make any autopilot kick off. Pilot error, inadequate pre-flight testing suspected on the Burlington accident, poor maintenance, or outright failure. We have to be prepared to both recognize and react to a variety of scenarios. It's not just enough to say more manual flying. If you're flying a PC-12 at night in weather, you can and should use the autopilot. The solution is not necessarily to use the autopilot less, but to make it an integral part of training so that you understand exactly how it works and how it can fail. I know during my initial training on the PC-12, I spent far more time practicing engine failures than autopilot failures. Yet based on the statistics above, that is exactly backwards. The PT-6 hardly ever quits, but the pilot-autopilot interface seems to be far less bulletproof. I now have over 1,000 hours in the Pilatus, and my anecdotal experience supports the story seen here in the accident reports. The airplane is built like a tank, and is surprisingly easy to fly, especially for a larger turboprop. There is no prop lever, the fuel is either on or off, and the airplane can happily fly at 220 knots or 100 knots indicated. But it's still a high-performance airplane, and thus it requires proficiency and a relentless commitment to training. The airplane can probably handle whatever missions you have planned. Can you? Okay, my thanks to John for writing that article. And Patreon supporter Bill Haug sent me a note referencing that same article, the Zimmerman article that I just read. And he wrote, Max, the last high-performance jet I flew, the Boeing 777, had an automatic robotic cockpit call-out of bank angle, which if memory serves initiated at 45 degrees. Seems like the PC-12 could use this feature, especially for IFR single-pilot flights, literally to help to keep the blue side up, Bill. And Bill also sent another note later. He said, Hi, Max, thinking a bit more about the Nevada Pilatus PC-12 fatal mishap and about the fact that several previous PC-12 mishaps seem to indicate inadvertent excessive angles of bank, possibly leading to excessive airspeed and altitude loss events. Here are the warning functions regarding the AOB in the 777 at my previous employer. Let's see, it says bank angle protection reduces the likelihood of exceeding the bank angle boundary due to external disturbances. Bank angle protection provides roll control wheel inputs when the bank angle exceeds the bank angle boundary protection of approximately 35 degrees. If the boundary is exceeded, the control wheel force rolls the airplane back to within 30 degrees of bank. This roll command can be overridden by the pilot. Maximum control wheel deflection always commands maximum control surface deflection. The autopilot disengage bar disables bank angle protection. Excessive bank angles are indicated on the PFD bank indicator. The indicator changes color to amber at bank angles exceeding 35 degrees. And he also gives a couple of other examples. He says the 777 has a minimum crew complement of 2 pilots in the vast majority of international operations. There's an FB and possibly an FC in the jump seats during takeoff and landing, so 3 or 4 sets of eyes. In the Pilatus single pilot operation, it appears that some sort of bank angle warning system could prevent fatal mishaps and hull losses. And just to tag on to what Bill says here, I just wanted to mention that Cirrus in the newer aircraft, I don't know when they implemented this, but it's been available for at least the last 7-8 years, has a system called ESP, which stands for Envelope System Protection. It includes a number of features, but if you are hand flying and you roll to 45 degrees of bank, the system will then force the stick, and you'll feel it move in your hand back to 30 degrees. And I'm sure that has probably saved 1 or 2 lives. I also had an email from someone, and I don't recall exactly who it was from. It might have been from Bill, in which they had contacted ForeFlight and suggested that they add a feature whenever you have an excessive bank angle to warn the pilot. And he got back a message that said, yeah, they'll certainly add that onto the possible list of future features to consider. And here's an email from Sean Michael. He says, "Hi, Max. I know that it's always terrible to have to do analysis of accidents, but I always appreciate your insights and incredible teaching. I was looking at the ADS-B track for the recent medevac crash, which is the one that we just talked about in the Reno Tahoe area, and felt it looked like a graveyard spiral. Single pilot IMC night flight, perhaps hand-flown at that point in the flight with a tight and then much more gradual left turn following that departure procedure, followed shortly thereafter by tightening right spiral descent on the accident flight." And I want to thank Sean Michael for sending me that particular email, as it is the one that triggered me to look at that particular crash and produce episode 267. I had heard about the crash before, but it was only after he sent that email that I decided to dig into it more deeply. So thanks so much, Sean, for contacting me. And I decided to look and see what the FAA had available for these types of issues, workload management for single pilot situations. And I found a document, I'll include a link to it, which is called Single Pilot Workload Management in Entry-Level Jets. It's a very long document, but I went down toward the bottom. I think this is around page 67, recommendations for workload management and automation use. And it says, in part, some of those best practices are also captured below in our list of recommended strategies for automation use and countermeasures to task overload and workload breakdowns. In the list of recommendations below, some are tentative and should be verified through future research. And here's their list. So these are bulleted items. To the extent that it is feasible, pilots should consider completing short, easily performed tasks associated with ATC clearances quickly, such as dialing in a new heading while listening to the rest of the ATC clearance. Pilots should be prepared to copy, in writing, or audio record an ATC clearance involving a reroute or hold and not try to rely upon their memory. When considering a task involving automation programming, participants should consider any time constraints related to intended automation function and time available to guide decisions about programming strategy and level or type of automation to select. Pilots should complete as many tasks as possible early during periods of low workload. Research is needed to evaluate the cost-benefit trade-offs of pilots programming an expected but not confirmed instrument approach while still at cruise. Pilots should avail themselves of the full range of workload management strategies, such as reducing airspeed with notification to ATC as required, being intentional when shedding or truncating tasks, altering type of control or management automation selected, and asking for ATC assistance, such as vectors, hold, etc. In times of high workload, when faced with needing to select a type of automation, pilots might consider the option of selecting a lower level of automation, e.g. control automation, initially to begin the task or maneuver, and, if appropriate, program a higher level of automation, e.g. management automation, to complete the maneuver as soon as possible to reduce their ongoing workload. During periods of automation mode changes, e.g. level off at top at climb, pilots should briefly refrain from other tasks and monitor the automation and aircraft behavior to make sure the aircraft performs the action as intended. That's a really good one. If the autopilot is not in use, The flight director should either be programmed or disengaged to eliminate distracting flight control prompts that do not match those actually being made. We suggest that pilots dial in the frequency for the instrument approach in use at their departure airport, if applicable, prior to departure, and have the charts easily accessible in case they need to immediately return to the airport after takeoff. And I'll take that a step further. I recommend people actually load the instrument approach that they will use if they have to land immediately after takeoff. When deferring a task until a later time, we suggest that pilots take a moment and form an explicit intention about completing the task and when. For example, say to yourself, quote, report to ATC when I level out at cruise. External memory aids or cues, such as placing an incomplete checklist between the throttle levers or on your lap, can also assist with recalling the need to perform deferred actions. So that's the list of the recommendations, and part of the summary says, technology is intended to make our lives easier and more productive. However, there are always unintended consequences involved with the introduction and use of technology. When it is incorporated into the cockpit of an aircraft, advanced cockpit displays and automated flight systems can relieve the pilot of many of the immediate tasks associated with navigating and flying the aircraft. At the same time, these systems also introduce a need to learn and memorize a bewildering amount of procedures and information for interacting with the automation in the aircraft. Well-designed automation is required to support an effective human-automation partnership and reduce the cognitive load associated with automation use. The current study has demonstrated that the presence of advanced technology in the cockpit does not necessarily eliminate high workload events during a flight. These events can tax a pilot's cognitive resources to the point that errors in navigation and flight control occur. We hope that the recommendations and research generated from this study will lead to safety and efficiency enhancements for single-pilot operation of technologically advanced aircraft. And I received a couple of emails from patron supporter Sam Dawson. He wrote, I guess I'm an aviation geek. I grew up on Long Island under the approach path for LaGuardia, and since then I have loved everything aviation. Even after almost 40 years of flying, I'm enchanted by flight, and at the twilight of my career, I continue to fly GA, volunteering as a mentor for the USMA flying team. He also wrote in a separate message, Max, the reader feedback show was another good one. That would be one of our prior mailbag shows. He said, you had some great advice. One of your listeners asked how they could improve their flying skills outside of preparing for their BFR. Your advice was spot on about seeking out new flying experiences such as a tailwheel endorsement. You also pointed out that it is no longer a BFR but a flight review. This sounds subtle, but there is a major difference in attitude that the FAA was trying to emphasize by the name change. I point out to GA pilots, especially those who have just completed their private check rides, that airline pilots who fly quite regularly take recurrent training, or now called AQP for Advanced Qualification Program, every 9 months and do online training each quarter. The training events normally consist of 2 days of simulator training and 2 hours of ground instruction each day. And yet, legally, a GA pilot who flies only occasionally needs only to see a CFI every other year for 1 hour of ground and flight training. I encourage GA pilots to participate in the FAA Wings program and set up their own AQP program. Try to take an online course at FAAsafety.gov at least every other month, or attend a local seminar or a Zoom class. Then set up flight training of some sort every 6 to 9 months. The flight training need not be the standard flight review. As long as you coordinate with the instructor ahead of time, almost anything can be a flight review. Tailwheel training, a high-performance or complex endorsement, checking out a new airplane, an IPC, the possibilities are endless. I also encourage pilots to set up simulator training if available. When you and I started flying, simulator training was out of reach for the average GA pilot. Now companies such as Redbird have brought simulator training to the average GA pilot and can be used for scenarios either tough to duplicate or too dangerous to replicate in the actual airplane. For example, engine failures on takeoff, both in multi-engine and single-engine airplanes, can be given numerous times in a short period, getting down the muscle memory of what to do. To set the example, I try to do the same. Although I have AQP events every 9 months that count as a flight review, I also do online courses and seminars for Wings credit and try to do some sort of GA training 3 to 4 months after my airline simulator training to help keep me proficient versus legal in GA. And Sam also sent another note. He wrote, another very good show. Referencing the discussion of the fatal DA42 crash in Norway during training, while it may not have been a factor in this crash, I do think the limited training on spins many CFIs receive is a factor in some crashes, particularly with multi-engine aircraft. I used to teach basic aerobatics and spin training in a super decathlon. I always took it to heart that an applicant should show instructor-level knowledge of spins and spin recovery. One level of emphasis I made, both on the ground and in the air, was the recognition of an incipient spin and how to stop an incipient spin from turning into a full-blown spin. Most GA airplanes in the utility and normal category need at least 1,000 feet, if not more, to recover from a fully established spin. With the traffic pattern at most airports being 1,000 feet AGL, the chances of recovering from a full spin in the pattern are slim to nothing. Some airplanes, multi-engine airplanes as an example, may not recover from a spin at any altitude. So again, recognition of an immediate recovery from an incipient spin is imperative. This point was driven home to me about 10 years ago while teaching in a Piper PA-34-200T Seneca in Rochester, New York. The lesson plan that day called for slow flight and power on and off stall recoveries. I had the student do some slow flight followed by an approach to landing power off stall. As the airplane stalled, the student rapidly applied full power prior to lowering the nose. Well, maybe I should say he attempted to add full power. One engine came up while the other engine coughed. The airplane immediately rolled and was in an incipient spin, aggravated by the student trying to correct the roll with aileron. Instinctively, I took the controls and simultaneously pushed the nose down and chopped the power. Once the nose was down, I leveled the wings and slowly brought power in on both engines. This event happened very rapidly, and if I had not reacted as I did, we would probably have entered a full spin. At that point, recovery would not have been guaranteed, and we might have become an NTSB statistic. After that, I include lowering the nose first as part of my power off stall recovery in a multi-engine airplane, an emphasis on smooth and gentle power application with a stop of power application if there was any indication of an engine problem. The other lesson is for pilots, especially CFI applicants, to seek out spin training that goes beyond the basics of doing a couple of spins. Keep up the good work and keep the sunny side up, Sam. Sam, thanks so much for your many emails. I greatly appreciate it. And here's an email from Anonymous. He wrote, "Hi, Max. I've just finished listening to episode 262 with Tom Turner. I appreciated both conversations about partial and total engine power loss events. The most recent episode really brought home the thoughts that I had listening to your show and reading through other accident reports about a partial power failure being more dangerous than a complete engine failure. Given that, it is interesting that Garmin's recent Smart Glide feature assumes partial power will continue when actively drawing the glide ring. Just another example that it is a good idea to train all different types of emergency scenarios so you know what to expect. Really appreciate your show every week." And Anonymous, I think you are just re-emphasizing a point that we made in episode 262, which is when you have partial power loss, don't assume that you'll continue to have that same amount of reduced power. Odds are that at some point you're going to have even less power, if not a total engine failure. And here's an email from new patron supporter Sierra Square, not his real name, obviously, but his initials. He wrote, "Hi, Max. Just joined after listening for a year and reaching maximum guilt level for not supporting you. The Bonanza Crash Show should be listened to by every pilot. Also, you probably don't remember me, but we were in college together." And I do remember him. We've since corresponded. He says, "I'm flying a G3 Cirrus SR20. A couple of questions. I noticed in this accident case that there was a lake nearby the airport. This was up in Westchester County in New York, just north of New York City. Wouldn't that have been a choice rather than consider the expressway as you mentioned in the show? I did not hear the controller talk much about or confirm altitude. That surprised me. Is there no need because he is on radar? But if so, doesn't the controller in that situation attempt to warn the pilot about descent rate and altitude? He was so close to getting to the airport. Is the evidence that he stalled or just descended into the trees? Finally, as a Cirrus pilot, my thought was this is an example of where, even if I declared an emergency sooner and could possibly make the airport, given the ceiling and visibility, I would have pulled the caps at 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Your thoughts? Any difference in thought when making a consideration in a highly populated area? And I wrote back to him that I would certainly prefer a lake over the trees in the summer, but probably not in the winter, as you could easily die of hypothermia in New York State in the wintertime if you're in the water. Though many people have successfully crashed in trees. Now, I wouldn't expect a controller during an emergency like this to read out the altitude to the pilot, as the pilot has that information in the cockpit. Also, the controller would be at best guessing the descent rate since it's not displayed on the radar screen. And yes, if I were in a Cirrus, I too would have pulled reaching 2,000 feet AGL, and I would do the same thing in a populated area, because there have been many instances of Cirrus aircraft descending under parachute onto houses, vehicles, trees, water, you name it, and it's turned out okay in all of these situations. And here's an email from Sam Dawson. He says, I don't know if you follow aviation accidents / this day in history on Facebook, but another fatal DA42 training crash on February 22nd in Slovakia during single-engine training. Not a DA42 issue, but a multi-engine training issue. I always considered multi-engine training to be the least forgiving training I did, especially in situations where one might get into a VMC / stall spin. I don't think enough emphasis is put on the fact that a VMC demo can quickly lead to a spin. This is an area where I think the use of simulators can help cut down on the fatal accident rate. Keep the sunny side up. And the link that he sent says that this is in Slovakia, a Diamond DA42 Twin Star operated by the Jet Age Flight School, registration OK-ZZK, was destroyed when it impacted the terrain. The CFI, one student pilot and 2 passengers were fatally injured. Preliminary information indicate that this was a training flight. One of the passengers was a student pilot, and the 2 remaining occupants were riding along. Online photos show that the airplane impacted a hillside at high speed. The wreckage spread over a wide area. A local TV news station stated that the accident most likely occurred during a single-engine training procedure where the pilot turns off one of the engines and starts it again. The CFI was a long-time experienced pilot of large commercial aircraft. Weather conditions were fine on the day of the accident. The reported temperature was around 10 degrees C, which would be about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And separately, but related, I just wanted to note that I had a conversation with Seth Lake on the phone a few weeks ago, in which we talked specifically about VMC demos in multi-engine aircraft. And he has a number of ideas on how those demos could be conducted differently to make them safer. And we'll try to get Seth on again in a future show to talk about that. And here's an email from patron supporter Stephen Hope. He says, I'm a big fan of the show. I've been flying for about 5 years, 600 plus hours, commercial instrument rated single engine land pilot. For the first 3+ years, my flying was training based, focused on earning ratings and in rental aircraft. About 1.5 years ago, I purchased a 2017 Cirrus SR20 and now have about 300 hours in it. I've listened to all 267 Aviation News Talk episodes, which to me is amazing. That's great, thank you. And learned so much invaluable information that has helped me with my training and made me a better and safer pilot. I learn something new almost every time I listen, which, by the way, is our goal, to try and include some nugget of information that's new to every listener in every show. He says, your recent episode 265 about P-static gave me a great duh moment. While I was taught what static wicks are and that they discharge static electricity from the airframe, because my training was for the most part in VMC, I never observed its impact on aircraft communications and don't remember any of my CFIs talking about what P-static can do to comms and navs. Not long after purchasing my SR20 and completing my transition training with your friend, Platinum CSIP Ed Waters, who I'll just mention does a lot of training at the Knoxville Delivery Center for Cirrus, he says, I flew my wife from my home airport in Concord, North Carolina, to John Toon, JWN Airport in Nashville, Tennessee, to visit one of our daughters, her husband, and my 3-year-old granddaughter. It was an IFR flight in IMC on climb out until we got above the cloud tops at 6,000 and on descent back through the clouds and rain. Based on the weather information I had, I expected to complete an instrument approach to JWN, but anticipated breaking out a few hundred feet above minimums. It was raining, but there was no convection, no expected significant turbulence, and based on the actual and forecast outside air temperatures, I did not expect to encounter icing. I was very comfortable flying in IMC under those conditions and flying any of the 3 approaches I could be given, having briefed them before departure and again in cruise. It was, however, going to be one of the first few hard IMC approaches I had flown at that time in the SR22, and the first I'd flown with my wife. The ATIS and Nashville approach controller told me to expect the RNAV runway 2, which I loaded into my FMC and briefed. As I was descending through the thick cloud layer and being vectored toward the IAF, my comm radio blew up with static. I could hear the approach controller talking but had no idea what he was saying. I tried to key up again a couple of times but couldn't get any intelligible response through all the static. It seemed like he was hearing me, however. Why was the comm radio in my high-tech airplane suddenly on the fritz at this critical moment in my flight? I had been told to expect a specific approach, was descended and being vectored in the direction of the IAF, but had not been cleared for the approach. My recently completed instrument training kicked in and I squawked 7600, told the approach controller that I had lost my comms, was joining the RNAV-2 at the IAF in case he could hear me, activated and flew the approach and had an uneventful landing. Assuming that all my comms were still out, I exited onto the taxiway, turned my plane toward the tower and flashed my landing lights. The tower gave me a green light gun signal, so I taxied to the FBO. Before shutdown, I checked my comms and couldn't find any problems. Now I know. It was the P-static. Duh! I talked to several seemingly experienced pilots in the FBO and told them my story. Not one of them suggested P-static as a possible cause. None of them had ever squawked 7600 before and thought it was cool that I'd use it to complete the approach. I felt that I handled everything as well as I could have in the moment, but next time I would try COM2 first. Thanks for teaching me something I should have known. Another great reason to be a Patreon supporter and Aviation News Talk listener. Cheers and keep the blue side up. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate you sharing that story with us, Stephen. And Patreon supporter Vaz Rajan wrote, he says, "Hi Max, on your recent episode about P-static, I'm wondering if you think having a portable handheld radio would be helpful in such a circumstance or if they are too range limited." Well, Vaz, it's certainly possible some of the time that might help, but not always. P-static is a very broadband noise, and it's a form of RFI, which stands for radio frequency interference, which is essentially being broadcast from your airplane. And since your handheld radio is close by, it may receive the same static that your comm radio is receiving. However, it may also depend upon which part of your plane is generating the RFI and how far away from your handheld radio it's located from that static source. So, yeah, you could give it a try, but it's certainly not a guaranteed solution. And from Patreon supporter Matt Reed, talking about the same subject, P-static, he says, "Had the same thing happen to me in a Cherokee about 15 years ago as a low-time, relatively fresh IFR single pilot. It was my first IMC flight in this plane, and it was the one time I didn't note my takeoff or even calculate an ETA for lost comm procedures, so I didn't know when I should start an approach. I could only hear ATC's broken replies when I asked to climb or descend. Luckily, I heard enough of it to know they didn't want me to change altitude. I managed to find a hole in the clouds and canceled, tried continuing VFR, but ultimately had to return to my origin as rain and mist obscured my destination. I talked to our mechanic and explained my thoughts, rain infiltrating the base of the antennas and shorting the coax connections to ground. He and I took off and recreated the flight with similar effects. Fine in the clouds, staticky in rain. We returned home and sealed the antenna bases with silicon. That seemed to cure it until the owner upgraded the radios and had the same issue. Then we installed static wicks, and wouldn't you know, problem solved. Much to the chagrin of some of the old hangar bums who said, that thing doesn't go fast enough to build a static charge." I wrote back to him, I said, that's pretty funny about the hangar bums. And it's amazing to me how much stuff pilots just make up rather than look up the facts. Matt, thanks so much for sharing that story. And I had a message from Joe14. He said, "I love your aviation news talk show. I'm a student pilot. Your show has helped me a lot. I'm learning to fly in a Hyper Warrior." I think he meant Piper, but it came out Hyper Warrior at Susanville Aviation in Susanville, California. And I wrote back, "Nice to hear from you. I'm glad you're enjoying the show. I flew into Susanville twice many years ago when I was taking my daughter to and from summer camp. I love that they had a courtesy car there at the airport. Have fun working on your private, and please tell one or two of your friends about Aviation News Talk." And Joe followed up and asked me to send a couple business cards for Aviation News Talk so he could post those at bulletin boards at a couple local airports, and I've just mailed those off to him. And if you'd like to do the same thing, send me an email, and I'll send you some cards to post at your airport as well. And, of course, the easiest way to reach me is just to go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and enter your email. And here are a couple emails regarding tetrahedrons. This one comes from patron supporter Vaz Rajan. He says, "Hi Max, in a recent episode you talked about tetrahedrons and where they might still exist. I have read about them when I did my private. Do they even still teach about them? I don't know. I think they do. I think it's still in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge." He says, "but had never seen one until recently. There is actually still one at Solberg Airport, N51, in New Jersey." Thanks so much for telling us about that. And here's a message from Eric Gravink of San Jose, California. He says, "As for tetrahedrons, when I first started flight training many, many moons ago, I trained out of Oscar 41 near Davis, California. They had one. I thought they were the norm as opposed to the oddity until I branched my flying out. Still makes me feel at home when I see one occasionally. Keep up the great work." And coincidentally, there was an article in generalaviationnews.com, and this goes back actually to 2019. I'll include a link to it in case you want to see the full story, but just to give you a quick outline of it, it said, "Call it a tetrahedron or an airport wind indicator. The objective is just the same. It tells incoming pilots the direction of the wind. At Eagles Crest Aerodrome, Delta Echo 25 in Milton, Delaware, we decided that having one of these would be a great addition to our 3,500-foot grass strip. We started with the tail fuselage of a Bell 47 helicopter that was abandoned and hanging from the rafters of a hangar in our community." It then goes into the details of how they created their own tetrahedron for the airport. Great story. And here's an email from Klaus. He says, "Rusty glider pilot here. I've been listening to your show since the beginning. Recently, you've discussed the impossible turn and engine out procedures. The impossible turn is also relevant to glider pilots. It surprises me that pilots who experience an engine failure need to perform calculations to determine best speed and glide slope. This may sound a bit low-tech, but the sound of the wind rushing by is a very important indicator to stable flight. If it's silent, you're going to stall. If it's too noisy, you're going too fast. It's important that pilots intuitively know what's normal. The impossible turn is never practiced but always discussed. I was flying in an airport that was surrounded by forests in all directions. For a winch takeoff, there is almost no forward horizontal speed. The angle of attack is very steep. There are 3 choices should the cable break during launch: land straight ahead, make the impossible turn and land, or fly the pattern. A break in the cable is part of the training at safe altitudes, 200 to 300 meters. Normal altitudes for winch takeoffs were 400 to 500 meters, enough to fly the pattern. One final note, it's important for glider pilots to fly clean. Glider pilots use rudder, elevator, and ailerons to make turns, but pilots who fly airplanes with engines only use ailerons to make turns, right? Thanks for the great podcast." And Klaus, pilots who fly airplanes are supposed to use both ailerons and rudder when they turn, but often rusty pilots don't use enough rudder. And many radio control pilots use no rudder at all, though things are much less serious when an RC plane crashes because there is nobody aboard these radio-controlled airplanes. And here's an email from Jonathan Fay. He says, "Listen to you all the time. I built and fly an experimental aircraft that is equipped for legacy-free IFR with a Garmin GTN 625 WAS-capable GPS. I intend to take my IFR check ride in my own airplane using just GPS approaches. When the March ruling came out allowing GPS-only approaches for the long cross-country requirements instead of 3 different navigation systems, I had hoped I could get a check ride, but everyone, including the folks at my FSDO and 2 DPEs I've called, were confused enough that they either could not commit to an answer or said I would need an ILS VOR NDB in addition to GPS in order to do the check ride. With so many legacy nav aids being decommissioned and many new aircraft being equipped with GPS only, and it clearly being legal to file and fly IFR on those airplanes, but not take a check ride, that just does not make sense. What is worse is I have seen many people training in GPS-only aircraft thinking that they will be able to do a check ride when they are ready and arguing that the March 2022 ruling makes it possible. With your connections, I'm sure you can clear this up. What is the situation now, and where do you think this will go?" Well, I didn't know, so I contacted an expert. My thanks to DPE Jason Blair, who we've had many times on this show in the past. He wrote back to me, "So we can't do 3 GPS-based approaches for a practical instrument test. They will need something other than a GPS-based approach to get a practical test done. A third approach could be an ILS, localizer, VOR, or NDB." He also writes that a GPS-based approach, if it has LPV minimums, can be substituted for the precision approach, that is the ILS, if the aircraft goes down to a minimum of 300 feet AGL or lower and has the vertical guidance or glide path. Like I said, it's common to fly both an LPV and an LNAV and something else, a third approach, for an instrument practical test. Hope that helps. Yes, it does, Jason. Thanks so very much for your reply. And if you have a free moment, please go ahead and leave a 5-star review for Aviation News Talk in whatever app that you use to listen to me. That way other people may be influenced by your recommendation to give us a listen. Speaking of listening, this is a listener-supported show, and we're still ad-free. So if you've been enjoying Aviation News Talk and you've learned something from it, please take the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blues side up. And remember that you can always go around.